and Property Committee to order. First item is public comment period. Does anybody wish to make a public comment? Anybody wish to make a public comment? Anybody wish to make a public comment? If not, we will move on to the minutes of the September 7th, 16th, 24th meeting, which were in the packet. What are your wishes?
Move to approve.
Moved by Supervisor Leahy. Is there a second?
Second by Fisher.
Second by Supervisor Fisher to approve. Any discussion? Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries. All right, next we'll move on to the American Rescue Plan update. The ARPA process criteria and timeline. I think we're going to pretty much dedicate our meeting to the discussion on ARPA at Supervisor Leahy's request, and I think appropriately so, because we've been talking around the issue, and a bunch of us just got back from Wisconsin Counties Association, and one of the sessions there was strategic planning and the ARPA funds. And just to refresh everyone, we have the 4 categories of eligible activities: public health and economic interest, premium pay for employees, lost revenue, and infrastructure.
And actually, if you look at the end of your packet, your categories must equal the blue highlighted ones. That is the only way the treasurer will accept your report. So when we do look at them, you're going to look at public health, negative economic impacts, service to disproportionately impacted communities. I'm going too fast. Premium pay, infrastructure, and revenue replacement plus admin for that. So even though there's 4, these are what the Treasury will accept as your categories when you report not only your expenses but what you're allocating.
So we have in the packet also the citizens feedback draft that categorize the comments that we received, and subsequent to that I've been receiving other requests. I know that the Village of Marathon City has a request that they've talked to Administrator Leonard and myself about, relative to potential expansion of their industrial park north of Highway 29, and looking for $2 million of funding for sewer and water in that area. But I think what we wanted to today was to see if we could try to categorize some of these the activities that were in that draft citizen feedback into categories, and then really begin to work on the criteria and the process. And Lance has prepared with staff a proposed timeline for ARPA requests that we might look at adopting. And he and I have had a conversation since this went in the packet, and a couple of tweaks to it, but I don't think we need to spend any time going on what are eligible activities. We're still waiting for the final Treasury rules. Christy, is there anything? You said Baker Tilly had the presentation, and they provided you with the some information.
Yeah, I'm going to have a demo with what they have available to do some of this tomorrow morning. And I also engaged our audit partner on reviewing our revenue loss. And so he's got some additional ties out to our financials, but he's got some additional things that we're going to look at in regards to federal revenues are not eligible. And we're going to use our single audit schedule for verifying the amount of federal revenues that we'll exclude from the calculation. So we've been working on that this week.
And then where are we relative to North Central Healthcare? And
That's what we have to.
We also have the audit partner looking at that as well, and they have made some preliminary determinations, but, I'm gonna probably touch base with him next week.
So just to add more detail to that, so the issue, and I think we've talked about this or alluded to this a little bit before, was whether the lost revenue calculation that Marathon County would submit could include the lost revenues related to the financials for Mount View Care Center. And the initial discussion started with North Central Healthcare's financial staff and their auditor. And there was initially some reticence, and I think there's still some reticence on letting us do that because North Central received what I believe the funds are called pandemic relief funds, PRF funds. So they were a little concerned that, because we received those funds, that they should not be, the county really shouldn't have those losses included on the lost revenue calculation. I don't know the answer to that. Like Christy said, we need to engage our auditor. I had preliminary conversations, or I should say brief conversations, with a couple other counties at the Wisconsin Counties Association. La Crosse County has put those lost revenues into their calculation, as has Sheboygan. So I think we just really need to make sure that there's alignment between the two auditors. I know North Central's auditors are certainly knowledgeable of government rules, but are primarily healthcare related auditors. And Baker Tilly, of course, with John and his team, are really far more knowledgeable with respect to the rules relative to government organizations. And I think we need to make sure that we just have all our ducks in a row, and ultimately we'll submit what we need to submit. But I'm relatively confident that we'll be able to include that.
is there any reason we should look at the nursing home separate from the other operations?
Yes, that I can tell you that there's some issues with it because it's a discretely represented component unit, which has its own tax ID number, is jointly owned by 3 counties, and specifically is probably not a portion of what we can consider county operations because of its diverse nature and locations. But the
North
nurse-
Central or the
Correct.
nursing, but the nursing home is,
That is separate, correct?
Yeah, I think, again, we need to check both,
Yep.
but the nursing home is the most pressing issue because, quite honestly, that's really what's driving a lot of the financial losses at North Central, or the 2 nursing homes. So I think this is also an issue for moving forward. So time will tell, but the good news is we have time. And the lost revenue calculation, we'll just update it when we get the best better information.
October 31st.
And even then, once if we ultimately change our opinion, we'll update it with additional information.
okay. Do we want to just go right into the criteria and then wait for the timelines and for Kurt? And that, can you pull up that scoring sheet? We've talked about in this group and with the public, the need to, set criteria. And some of the criteria that we've talked about in the past was recognizing that this is one-time money. We wanted to make sure that we didn't use it for operational side of things that were continuing obligations. We also, and part of that is the sustainability of any investment that we make. We wanted to make sure that we were following both the ARPA Department of Treasury guidelines, as well as the state public purpose, or is it public purpose policy, and compliant with both the state and the federal laws. And obviously we've got projects that need to be encumbered by December 31st of 2014, with the last expenditure and reporting done by December 31st of 2026, which gives us less than 5 years to spend the money, which is a long time, but it isn't a long time. We have to, do we have to have all of the paperwork in by that time frame, or just the expenditure?
It has to be encumbered. So I would have to file a report saying
They're encumbered by 24,
Correct.
2024, but for the 2026,
it has
spent
to be spent,
and documented.
correct.
So we probably have a 2 months period to make sure, so we probably have until the end of October, early November.
It's a quarterly reporting, they haven't said what the final is, but usually, so for September, the end of, as of Thursday, this Thursday, if we had a quarterly report, it is due October 31st. So I most likely will be December 31st, 2026 would be January 31st, 2027, and then they may have a final rollout or something.
So if you could pull up the ranking
Sure.
sheet, we're gonna share with you the screen that shows what we use for the capital improvement process. And Lance, do you want to give an overview of
Sure.
that?
I can give a high level overview, so you will recall, and many of you were
And
part
which,
of the work group on the capital improvement ranking form. It was the
you
one
want the
John-
PDF one?
That's fine.
Okay.
So just historical background, that's one of the tools that the capital improvement committee had used in the past to really try to aid them in ranking projects. So they looked at things such as, you'll see right at the top, regulatory compliance, and then had a metric of scoring from 0 to 2 that provided some kind of framework for how the individual project would be scored. So Christy, if you could scroll down,
Bet.
I believe there are a number of criteria, but essentially just a simple scoring sheet to try to get at each of the things that, from a perspective of capital improvement, were important factors to consider. So again, you'll see existing end of life where there were unique circumstances, all the things that, again, when according to the county board, the capital improvement committee thought were things they should factor into their ultimate determination as to how to rank all of the projects that ultimately came before it for funding. So the discussion that Chair Robinson and I had was, perhaps it's an analogous situation to the situation we see ourselves in with capital improvement, with the buckets that you've discussed relative to available ARPA spending, and what are the things that the criteria that you put together, that again is in your packet, that you want to essentially score projects. So things such as, is there already a duplicative program at a federal or state level? Is there, the degree of economic development or economic impact? All those criteria that were, or factors that were set forth in that sheet, we could adopt a similar framework to that capital improvement scoring. So that's why I believe the chair wanted to have that conversation and see what the committee's prerogative was to perhaps utilize that or not.
Or, utilize some form of it. I think
we need to
we would have to adopt
modify
it.
the criteria, of course.
Yeah. So there's a separate document on the value. Well, basically, there's a requirement that they submit an application
Show that.
as part of that. And we can. I think one of the first things we want to do is make sure that it's eligible under ARPA. And then do we want to have some threshold? Obviously, threshold criteria is the application complete? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And Lance has proposed a schedule of 3 application periods per year, which I think is good. I think if you do less, at least initially, what you run the risk of is encouraging incomplete packages to come in prematurely. And if you do it quarterly, or not quarterly, but every 4 months, you'll give people an opportunity to give us better, hopefully, submittals, so we can review them. But I think that will be one of the things that we would need to agree on. But yeah, there's a request form. So if you look at that request form, they get into a number of questions on the project, and these can come internally and externally. That's the difference between the CIP process and the ARP process. So anybody in the community could submit an application. We received requests from the Greater Wausau Prosperity Partnership. We received requests at the public hearings. We received requests from the Community Partners Campus, the Village of Marathon City, and others. But it might be good to direct them to an application process and have a more formal process that we would go through, and then we can, it equalizes the process and it allows for a better evaluation. I guess, does anybody have is there consensus that we ought to go through a formal application process, particularly for externals?
Yeah, I don't mind that idea. I just, this is a really complicated one, and that is kind of why we've been working to change the CIP system itself.
Right.
So I think, yes, we need a process, a form, an application, but could we commit to it being less than what this is, a more concise sort of application?
It can be whatever you want. We just wanted, the CIP process is before you, not for adoption.
Correct. An
It is for
example.
you for enlightenment. And it may be a good, I think that there were problems with it, and one of the problems was we kept carving out different parts and doing set-asides for rolling stock, for IT and the black hole. Just seeing if Jerry's listening.
I'm listening. I'm gonna start reading black.
I'm wondering if it would just be helpful to start throwing out ideas then for what kind of questions we would ask of
Yes.
entities that were, like one of the first things I thought of was, the person or the entity, the governmental, are they able to access other types of funding besides ARPA funding to support their request? Things like that, and then we can go from there.
I think we ought to throw them at the table or at the wall and see what sticks.
Number one, which category you fall under?
Pre-election ad yet for them.
Chairman, we do have a full committee. All members are either present in person or on web.
I saw that with Craig's joining us. So we're just going through, Craig, you just joined us. We're trying to set up what criteria we might use in sort of in the solicitation of proposals for evaluation by this committee. And what we heard is, I think we want to know what category they fall under, which is, 4 or 5 categories that issue of premium pay, lost revenue, infrastructure, health, and they've separated out economic development, or benefiting low income. That's the sort of the catch-all. But I think what Allison has thrown out is, are there other funds available that we can, are we looking at that to be not the first source, but rather the last source of funding? What's our purpose in asking, are there other funds available?
You threw out like the Wasser Greater Prosperity Project,
Right,
and I feel like that's an entity that has other funding sources probably available to it. They have the ability to access money from other sources, from private sources, from non-governmental sources. Whereas some other requests that might come in, you know, a governmental source might be the only way they could fund their request. They wouldn't have the ability to access perhaps private donations or, you know, other avenues like that.
So is that an absolute, you know, when we start developing criteria, if you have access to others, you're not eligible here, or is it factored in as a match, and do we look at,
I would need that anyway, your description, in order to make sure that it was eligible on a administrative level.
Yeah.
So that for a operations, excellent, so you could, I think in the CIP, that one of the questions was, is it a match, a grant match?
Yeah.
Do you have other funding sources? What percentage of the request given to us is part of the total project? So you could get to your idea, and it would also cover us in regards to making sure that it was an eligible cost, it wasn't conflicting with a different grant source, if that's helpful.
Mr. Chairman,
go ahead.
just a quick question then, I just following up on what you were, what you mentioned then. So would that disqualify an entity from applying for it if there was alternative fundings that they could apply for then?
Allison's shaking no, I would think no.
That's a whole other question, I guess, you know.
It would be part of the evaluation process.
Yeah.
I don't know that it, you know, specifically would disqualify someone, but it clearly is going to go to whether or not that's the highest need and use that we want to prioritize.
So so it would be one of the factors, and maybe what we gotta do is get the factors on the table, and then we gotta go back and revisit them and try, what other factors, and again,
What's the long-term economic impact? And if you want to call it something, ROI, return on the investment to the taxpayers in Marion County. Again, it's one time, this is one-time funding. We are not gonna have another, probably not going to have another opportunity like this, probably in the next 20 years, 10 years. So we need to get it right, and it needs to have an economic impact that is a return on the investment.
And I know one of the things that you've thrown out in our discussions has been the whole issue of sustainability.
Correct.
And, you know, should one of those questions be, are there any
Is it long-term
operational costs
operational costs?
beyond ARPA, you know, in, I don't know if you use a 24 or 26 deadline. We've got again, those issues of compliance with Treasury guidance and state law. I think one of the things we would want to look at and evaluate based upon what we heard today and others, Kurt, you were in that meeting, is that whole issue of does the project impact or assist those impacted by the pandemic? And I'm not sure what the exact language is, but we heard that in low income parties and those impacted.
If you, I will share the screen. I do wanna make sure you are aware that there are measurements that you must include. As you can see, public health, number 1.1, vaccination has a little caret symbol. You do have to provide areas where recipients must report whether projects are primarily serving disadvantaged communities. You see the asterisks. denotes we're a recipient, that would be us, because we're the county receiving the funds, must identify the amount of the total funds that are allocated to evidence-based interventions, and then you have to look at the use of evidence. So there is, even in the requirements, the ability for you to have to demonstrate it being either evidence of use or hits the disproportionately disadvantaged people.
Any other thoughts on criteria that we should be considering?
Mr. Chair,
Go ahead.
one thing that we discussed during the listening sessions that were conducted, and it's certainly as your administrator, it's something that I hope you consider, is whether, building on the idea of long-term operational sustainability, that criteria can be whether or not this new program or other entity is sustainable long-term as a result of the allocation. But does the allocation actually improve the long-term sustainability of the Marathon County government budget? In my mind, those are two separate things.
Other things, and I think what we'll do is just, again, get them out there on the table.
Would you like me to read them back to you so that just make sure that you kind of know where we're at?
Sure.
Okay, first is category. So we have our categories listed. Second is funding sources. And of that, there are three separate criteria or questions that we would ask. What would ARPA funds be as a total percentage of the total project cost? It would be part of the evaluation process, so that if there's other funding, would not automatically eliminate it from consideration. And then the other would be the highest need and use. So using donated funds, ARPA funds. So that would be the second idea we had out there. So category funding. Third is return on, and these aren't in numeric order, they're just the discussion. Third is return on investment to Marathon County taxpayers. Fourth is sustainability, and there are two separate items under that. One is the sustainability or economic impact to the taxpayers, and does it improve the Marathon County budget? Sustainability also includes, does it sustain the services or organization long-term by investing ARPA funds to that project or that service? Third is, or the sixth one is compliance to the law. And seventh is the impact to the effective group or service.
Others?
I'll go back up to the feedback, so we see.
Yeah, what about, does the request address any of the public feedback in any way?
Yeah. Well, the problem with the feedback is it's an iterative process. And we've encouraged the public to come forward with ideas. I hate to say that because something came in before
Sure.
a date certain, that it had priority over something that came in later, unless you disagree with me. I don't know that the timing of the request is there. I think what we're trying to do is just get an understanding of what we've heard to date. And again, since this came out, there have been several requests.
thought just occurred to me, and I'm gonna probably steal Vice Chair McEwen's thunder here, but alignment with the strategic plan, perhaps, the county's strategic plan.
Yep.
Or even the comprehensive plan.
I would like to, on the percentage, on the issue of what are they asking for in terms of percentage of the project? Are there opportunities for us to collaborate, and are we collaborating with other local units of government? And one of the evaluation criteria that we need to put in there, and I think getting at your point, is are there other funding sources available from the state and federal government?
We don't want to be duplicative.
I just wrote that down.
And I think the intent there is where the funding source of last resort. Do we want to specifically put in a criteria, the likelihood that the project will be completed within project deadlines? Because that forces us and them to address it. Because it doesn't do us any good to commit $2 million for a project that's done in 2027.
That's excellent, because we've been finding with the vehicles that kind of lessen, but best intentions are to,
Being able to receive.
yeah, you can't get steel, you can't get microchips, so.
Or fiber unless you. Other criteria? In the CIP process had sort of an evaluation of, awarding numerical standards to come up with a score, but we can talk about that later. Other thoughts, Lance?
I'm just thinking, building on what I talked about, the strat plan and the comprehensive plan, the county has gone through the exercise of priority-based budgeting, and some of the questions that they asked are, the population impacted, like we look about impact of the project on disproportionately impacted groups, which can be a narrow, it's perhaps a subset of the overall population. But do you want to give more points essentially to a project that impacts a large number of people? So it's kind of between the ROI sort of evaluation and the impact on individual populations.
So the number of people served.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, that's a succinct, yeah, we'll go with that.
Or geographic, the CIP also has geographic, and I'm thinking
Well,
the broadband.
Number of people served is good.
I think the number of, because geographic has to be, well, it has to relate back to the population of America.
Okay. That's probably put that in there.
Kirk had something in there about return on investment. How is that?
I think we're,
I was thinking about the courts project, trying to be submitted as.
I think that's a detail we'll have to get to.
Yeah.
I don't know that we know.
Okay, so it's just a broader thing of.
Right now, we're just
include
throwing
return on
things on the,
investment in the
yeah,
criteria.
and we'll embellish them. Some of it is, until we get final rules, nothing's final.
Right.
Other criteria.
Question, I can't read the print up there, but did they give us any guidance on how to select broadband? I know they selected broadband projects, but they bullets and anything, or any about the selection? Is it just like what we just talked about, the number of people?
This is the feedback, but I can tell you what the
Oh,
criteria
that was
says.
citizen feedback. Oh,
Yep.
sorry. I thought that was one of the, never mind.
No, but I do
Scratch
have,
that. I thought you were looking at the
Jerry, on
That's the
summary
broad-
from Wadeco or something like that.
on broadband, it has last mile projects or other.
I'm just thinking about the criteria, how that affects it eventually.
Yep.
And my question was whether they already had given us something.
Yeah.
So they don't necessarily require you to differentiate, well, they just require that you differentiate between last mile and middle mile. You know,
And
there's
other.
not
But
necessarily.
they haven't
a
specified
criteria.
which one's more important.
No,
No,
So it sounds like,
no.
but we would cover it a little bit by how many people are affected. If we use that as a criteria.
Do we want to put in any requirements as expected outcome of the investment? And I'm thinking specifically about the request that's coming from ERC as it relates to the watershed. And I'm just, is there a performance measure, an outcome measurement that we're looking at? Or should we be trying to get outcome measurements for some of these investments?
That would be different than ROI and population served.
The ROI is more of an internal. And I'm thinking, you look at ROI, if we get the Village of Marathon City's request to do the sewer and water extension or beyond 29 for $2 million, what expectations would we have for that project? Do we want to ask them to delineate what value that project brings? You know, I'm just trying to figure out is that a narrative question or an evaluation criteria? And if it's a narrative description, how do we build it into the evaluation process?
dollar amount versus the number of people served by the municipal utility. Would be one.
We can think about that one.
So, if I may, Mr. Chair, I don't know if this is, the intent of your comment. One of the things this committee had talked about before was separating out, not only having criteria, but then saying, pursuant to kind of this breakdown, we want to have $2 million that we're going to allocate toward perhaps like projects related to the environment. $5 million of projects related to public health or
Broadband.
broadband, right? So perhaps is that what you were trying to get at with, like, what is
Is
the,
there an allocation
what's
to
the
each of the
outcome,
buckets?
like the outcome of the clean water, like we want this to impact clean water?
But what I'd like to do is for instance, if we're dealing with clean water, what's the % reduction in phosphorus and or, in that case, it's tied into a total maximum daily limit, it's an impaired waterway. So we do the investment over years. What is the expected outcome benefiting?
So do you want to have the presence of clear key performance indicators as a criteria for your project, so that you'd say, like,
Yeah.
rather than some amorphous projects, like, here's my project and I have, these are the performance
Deliverables.
measures that I'm gonna deliver on, and my
Yes.
ability to track them? So
Are there
you wanna, so to just make sure I understand this when staff try to build this form, you want to essentially have us give more points to projects that have clear deliverables that are easily measured. That, like, saying that surely
As it relates to, I think what you're talking about is also tying it into the strategic plan.
Yeah.
Right?
as a single criteria or separate then? it could be within the strategic plan, which is a good thing in of its
Yeah.
own, but also have clear deliverables, which are good. So double good if it fits within the strategic plan.
Yes.
Okay, all right, I think I understand what I.
And I think this is, we're gonna take what we do today,
And
flush
look
it
at-
out and come back. I think one of the things that we're missing in here is, that whole public health area. It's a criteria, but will it help us
Long term.
long-term with, addressing public health needs? And that gets into the strategic plan from a healthiest, safest, but is there a way for us, do we need to do a specific one for public health?
Well, the ultimate question becomes, do we want to allocate so many, and I think this is what you
Yeah.
were trying to get at, Lance, was, do you want to allocate X number of dollars of the 26 million to each of the 4 categories, pulling out potentially the lost revenue section, because that can be used for anything that the government entity, Marathon County, can do legally.
You're saying preemptively set those dollar amounts?
Well, that's what I'm asking. Do we want to do that? I'm throwing out the question.
I don't know if we know yet. I think what we could do is do some interim.
I know I was talking to several other counties, and they have in some cases allocated X number of dollars to broadband, X number of dollars to
Yeah.
public health, X number of dollars to, each of the categories. And I'm not advocating for it, I'm just saying, bringing it up for discussion.
What do the members of the committee think? Yee or Jonathan or Jennifer or Craig?
John, this is Greg.
Yeah,
I think it's we don't know, how much, money we should put into each one of these categories, but I think it would be a good start to give us an idea, which categories we, and start filling in the empty spots that are in those categories. I think it'd be a good way to start it. We don't know how much we're gonna, 5 million into broadband and 5 million into, the other ones. I don't know. Some projects are a lot more expensive. You might be able to get a lot more smaller projects versus some of the bigger projects.
Well,
go ahead.
The one, I think, if I looked at this, I think the first carve out that I would want to do is an estimated amount that is lost revenue. That has the most flexibility and can potentially impact the budget the greatest, because it can be used over the next 5 years for budget items. And we can still use the criteria that we're developing that now potentially is outside of the purview of the other specific areas. And that's why I think we work at it backwards, and that is estimate what we can best estimate what the lost revenue calculation is, and that carve out is now over here separately. And then the remaining, that's not to say that you still can't use the portion of the lost revenue in any of the other categories. It's just saying that portion has got the most flexibility. Does that make, I think that, to me, that makes the most sense.
One of the other things just for discussion I'm throwing out is we could deal with this in tranches. We could deal with the tranche number 1, the first 13 million, and say for the first 13 million, X goes here, X goes there, and then we can at a later time try to adjust those if you think there's value in that. That gives us the perspective of time, understanding of how the process works, what the demands might be. Do we want to deal with tranches?
Well, I think the other thing, yeah, that's an idea. The other thing I think that was brought up today is, some of the impacts of the pandemic are not yet known.
Right.
And so I don't know that we need to be in an absolute rush to get the dollars out the door. And then come later next year, because I just heard, unfortunately, we now have another variant in California that has been identified. That variant is R1, and they already have 50 cases identified in California. So this pandemic is potentially far from over because we continue to have the number of unvaccinated people. And we have roughly a third of the cases now of the COVID is breakthrough cases.
Yeah.
And so, like I said, I think we need to really be mindful of the fact that we may not be out of this for another 2 years or 3 years.
And there's some thought that it could be disruptive to the economy.
Exactly.
which we're
I think
seeing.
we're already seeing some of those impacts to the economy. I mean, last week I had the opportunity to visit the UP. Coming back, there was multiple restaurants that were literally, the sign on the door said closed, cannot get employees. Or closing at 1 o'clock because I have no staff to cover the shift. I had another restaurant we stopped at. The individual was on 12-hour shifts, working 7 days a week. You know, I give her credit for willingness to work there, and she was cheerful too. Yeah. Like I said, I think there's some things that are not known yet, and we need to be mindful of that those unexpecteds are still yet to be coming. And we may have, additional PPE requirements. We may have additional health issues to deal with. And so I just, I know we need to get the dollars out there, but also need to be cautious to the fact of the unknowns.
So maybe this is something we already discussed, but does that mean we do intend to take these requests, judge them, say yes or no, but give a time frame for that money going out? That would all be at once or at varying points, or is that a part of this, I guess?
I think we need to define the
Develop a
process by which we will allocate resources, what we want to hold in reserves for emergencies, what we want to do. I think we have to give some thought. I'm just going to interject this. We're going to want to give some thought to those investments that might be
More time.
time sensitive in terms of if we do a fiber project, we can't assume that it will be decide today, install tomorrow.
Right.
Because you may have a year and a half
Maybe
wait potentially with
2
fiber.
years or right there.
So we might have to give some thought to, are there delays, and maybe we need to, as a committee, identify, let's say we put aside hypothetically 5 million for broadband or for infrastructure, let's say infrastructure. And then we can look at that and we say, we might want to commit more of those dollars early than late, just to make sure that we've got the fiber
The ability to complete the project on time.
on time. So we might want to, as a committee, so first thing, how would we evaluate them? If we do these other things, are there within those categories some sensitivities?
I think you alluded to it a little earlier, expected completion before the deadline. I think that is fitting into that same thing.
Yeah.
Being cognizant of the fact that you may have supply chain issues. Right now I'm hearing if you order fiber today, 2 years before delivery right now. That's what I'm hearing.
Other criteria that we use to evaluate.
Do we want, when Christy mentioned like the asterisks and the caret, do we want the request to include some of that research, some of that initial information about either the the science behind it, or is that mostly gonna fall on us?
I'm expecting the person that
Okay.
asked the money to tell me why
Exactly
it
why.
needs that.
That's part of it, perfect.
Give us an overview of the project, a description, how it complies with it, how it addresses the county's strategic plan, how it addresses the criteria laid out by the Department of Treasury, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We want them to do the work. We don't want to
Okay,
chase that
that's great.
down.
Yeah, before the county board allocates the money, you wanna have assurance that they have a plan to get the information they need.
Yep.
Otherwise, you're trying to chase down
After the
data
fact.
from people that already have the money.
So what's on the screen right now is sort of the timeline, and Lance threw together this, my conversation, why don't you describe it and then I'll share
So
my comments.
So the idea here was to get something on paper that captured the discussion you had previously. Essentially to have all of the ARPA allocations take place outside of the county budget process through this application assessment and decision-making process. So, and the dates can certainly shift. You'll see they're not entirely equal. We tried to work around kind of busy times that you already have within your committee calendar and the county board budget process. But essentially, we structured it, and Sarah made it very nice and visual, which is helpful to end up with 3 applications a year. One essentially applications taking place at the end of the year and closing at the beginning of the year. One kind of moving through June, and then the last one concluding essentially just prior to the, in line with essentially the budget presentation to the full board. But the assessment process then is going to happen outside the budget process immediately, essentially to follow it. But that was the idea, again, to keep it outside of the budget process and to give some sort of timeline. We thought 3 times per year was ambitious, but not overly so. I think if you go quarterly, your calendar fills up very quickly. You guys already have very long and frequent meetings, so we tried to be mindful of that.
Lance and I talked, and I like the idea of 3. I've seen a lot of intent to apply programs that do once a year or twice a year. What you tend to have happen is the less frequent they are, sometimes people rush if they're not ready to get the application, and we don't get good projects. I'd suggest that we look at December, April, and August, and the reason is the December would catch those things that were raised during the budget process, but remove it from the budget process. The April gives you time to recover from the budget process and put something in. August sort of gets at that. You can be discussing those things in the context of the budget and its relationship to other activities. And I just throw those dates out there for discussion, but then it's a 4-month period in between each. So you'd be December, April, and August. And I think we've got a lot of other requests that come in August from department heads. But I think it takes it out of some of our busy cycles.
What if there's parts of the request that, and I don't, just talking off the top of my head, if it's part of the budget though. In other words, I'll give you an example. If we were to use some of the ARPA funds for mental health and NCAC funding requests for the upcoming year and utilizing that in the budget process, rather than, because if we take it all outside of the process, then that's the only.
Your August deadline would probably get you into that consideration.
The blue one.
Well, it would, but if this year is a request, but if there's a request this year.
I think this year's kind of
Well,
Well, I think that
the question is, how do we handle the feedback we've gotten to date? Do we treat that as, we're gonna have some projects that are gonna be generated as a result of that. We were talking about childcare. I think we're looking, you know, you raise a good question. How do we deal with year one? And how do we move forward?
I totally agree with, you know, the approach, keeping the vast majority of it outside the budget. I just, knowing what the initial request was from NCHC, and trying to fit that into the current budget, is gonna be difficult.
Do we want to flag 2021 and saying that the committee will consider request separately, but beginning for 2022? This is the timeline? I'm asking.
If I may, in terms of timeline, I'm thinking remember, we're gonna have projects that are gonna be coming in from outside. And those are not really beholden to your budget calendar, but if there are things that, as Chair Gibbs points out, that are being either discussed as part of the budget discussions with departments, or as a result of the budget don't get funded, things that may get funded through the budget. I propose a budget, or the county board ultimately approves a budget where they're not. We could get, under this timeline, budgets approved November 9th. You'd have from November 9th through January 15th to firm up an application, get it in front of the HR Finance and Property in February, and the county board would approve it in essentially March.
Unless you move that to December.
Unless you shorten it we could shorten it 1 month, because you do have time on the kind of phase 2 is exceedingly long. So we can, if you're comfortable with 3 times a year, we can bring back a revised timeline. What I hear you saying is something a little bit more immediate following the budget. So budget really is done in November, perhaps have applications due December 15th. Gives them 1 month.
I don't know if you're gonna have.
No matter what we do, there are gonna be issues with timing and how it sequences with other events.
So one thing on your criteria though, do you want to have a weight for internal versus external?
I think they have that already. That's the sustainability of the program or project and its impact on the county government budget. We'll have to flush out what that means.
I think we've got ways of factoring that in.
And I'll take a look at the CIP because I think there was something on his previous CIP ranking that included kind of separate little path for external requests.
And I was gonna look at the environmental impact fund. And I did not have a chance to do that because that had a process. We don't use it anymore, but there may be some value in us looking at what criteria we used in
That
that.
process changed almost every year too, so.
Yeah, but we can learn, you know, maybe there's some criteria in there that we might learn from. I agree.
John,
That was
this is
Go ahead, Greg.
just a question. You had brought up, was it the Village of Marathon wanted $2 million for a water improvement project?
They're arguing that it's an economic development approach, and Andy was gonna potentially join us today, and I said we would look at criteria. But he made the request to both Lance and to myself informally. There's no formal request, but we know that's out there, so.
So I guess my question, would there be separate criteria? Because I know all these, the municipalities received ARPA funds do we request they use theirs and then we would use the rest? Or if, say, we would approve it, put it in there, they don't, would there be some criteria as far as how they use their funds, for that project also?
Well,
That was
one of the
budgeted.
questions that you're asking is, Craig, is when you look at, is there other resources available? And you can clearly state that they received ARPA funds, and are they using their ARPA funds for this, or are they using it for something else? And then requesting our ARPA.
That's what I was, that's what I was getting at. So there could be, separate requirements from municipalities because they're receiving ARPA funds, yet they want us to utilize $2 million of ours, and are they gonna also, say it's 2 million and they get 300,000, are we gonna require that they use those ARPA funds and then we would use the rest from ours?
That's one of the questions that we'll have to get into, flush out during the criteria.
I'm showing on the CIP, there was a fiscal it's a little different, but there is a fiscal criteria which shows external funding and it gives you points in regards to the amount of external funding. And this again was for CIP, but there was an item that did provide at least some criteria and scoring due to the nature of the funding sources.
Okay. All right, just a thought. Thank you.
So we've got a number of criteria. Jennifer, Jonathan, anything you want to add? Any of you?
Supervisor Gibbs, we also had one for return on investment. So again, we'll definitely modify it, but there was one also for CIP.
Supervisor Fisher here.
Go ahead.
Christy, could you read the newest cumulative listing at this point? I know that's, we've gotten to the point now, it seems like there are quite a number in, readily teed up to be available in regards to criteria already. So could you just recap the list, please?
I'm going to show you the long list and the short one. One is category, 2 is funding, and that would include match, private, sole source, and what percentage of the project ARPA would be. That's all in funding. 3 is return on investment to the Marathon County taxpayers. 4 is sustainability, which includes improvement of long-term sustainability of the Marathon County budget and also sustainability of the long-term sustainability of the entity or group, if it's like an external group. Compliance to the law, impact to the affected group or service. Does it address public need? Alignment with the county's strategic and or comp plan, collaboration with other municipalities. Collaborating with them, but not duplicating services or funding. Likelihood to complete the project on time. Side note is to look at priority-based budgeting for some of the questions. That would include percentage of population served or impacted,
Number.
number of people served, or the population impacted. Geographic served is a note because it must be a Marathon County. It's not a question, it's just a note we need to be mindful of.
Christy, can I stop you there?
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be in Marathon County, it needs to benefit Marathon
Thank
County
you.
residents.
Thank you.
They talked about that today.
Yeah, in case we wanted to do a more regional type of activity, we wouldn't want to exclude it on purpose.
14, is there any 14 was a question of, do we want to allocate funding to the separate buckets such as public health, premium pay, economic disadvantaged? So that's a question. under that, considering whether or not you wanna do it as tranche 1 and tranche 2, considering you may not wanna allocate all of it right away because the pandemic impacts are unknown. So that was the allocation. Are there clear performance indicators or deliverables? And then question of, do those align with the county strategic plan? Again, we had some questions on allocation. One of the suggestions is to pull out the lost revenue as a carve out. And then that would be pulled out first, and then allocations could be allocated to the categories. Next was some time sensitivity and the completion date. And then we talked about the timeline 3 times a year. How are we going to deal with requests within the current budget? And then I wrote in general that it looks like the main themes are overview of the project, the categories, strategic plan, group served, funding, timing, and objectives. And that's what I have.
Would it help if we sat down, with administration between now and next meeting and try to flush those out and try to get some questions that might be helpful for
The
enlightenment?
next meeting is a budget meeting
Well,
after
I would,
so-
I would take it to the educational meeting. I think the next meeting we're full. And so what I'd like to do until we get ARPA resolved is as much as we can, that second meeting of the month, dedicated to trying to get ARPA, our approach to ARPA, and not bring in a lot of other items unless there's a critical need. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yes.
And that gives staff a time to react in between, and us a chance to think a little bit about it. Let's stick with that. So we can take that criteria, look at, we'll talk to Lance and we'll get, for purposes of discussion, the next time we meet, we'll throw some placeholder numbers at some of these things for discussion purposes only. If we can, we'll just make, for lack of a better term, Lance and I and Christy will come up with a number, we'll throw it out there and we can move it, but it will give you an idea, again, then of what we might look at. If that makes sense.
Yes, I concur.
And we're reacting and not starting out. So we've got enough to run with. Is there anything else that you want us to look at in trying to frame out our policy?
I think we've got enough to work on right now and react to, and I'm sure there'll be potential additionals as we, start to flesh out these. We may see additional opportunities, additional changes.
Are you content, Yi, or is Yi still one?
I'm still here. I'm just trying to reflect on what's being discussed here and also trying to think about other grant process or organizations, the area here, and kind of try and not create recreate the wheel here. So just need some time to reflect.
And I think that's, appropriate. We, staff has to, we can start on the stuff that we've already done, but like I said, next time, if we've had additional ideas, we can bring them in on the next meeting.
It's iterative. This really is an iterative process.
We don't have a deadline, hard deadline to, need to get it right, not quick.
Anything else on ARPA? And again, we're still waiting for the final rule.
That's what I was just gonna say, if there's any guidance changes, we'll alert you at those meetings too.
And you're going to, as we get through this from a financial perspective, have more direction for us as well through the Baker Tilly and other associations that you've got. So we'll benefit from that. And I think we need, you know, one of the reasons we need this is because we're getting those requests from different people. And we need to have a process by which we can say, we hear you, we're not ready for your project at this time. Here's our approximate timeline, here's what we're thinking about, and we can give them a little bit more direction. Kurt?
Yeah, just another side note on the lost revenue calculation. Had several discussions with administrators and other counties that have. I think we're gonna at some point get some clarification as far as the NCHC portion. If there is allocation that may add to the lost revenue section. The understanding that the other counties also drew down those same dollars that NCHC did for the nursing home. And on the county-owned, specific county-owned nursing homes, they still have guidance or have asked the question and answered it that those losses are still allocatable to lost revenue. And they can still exclude that because those funding sources were CARES Act funding and federal government, so those additional fundings can be removed from the from their revenue before you calculate the lost revenue.
More to come. Yep. More to come. Anything else on ARPA? If not, that concludes our meeting. The next meeting is the 5th. Budget.
I think you have item number 7 as an update on the,
2022
Oh,
budget.
I'm sorry.
That's pretty much it.
that's it. You're gonna get it next week.
I don't want Mike getting in trouble, they get us in trouble for telling
Mr.
them.
Chairman, I don't know if you've been made aware, but the Mount View open house and ribbon cutting is also set now for October 5th from 3 o'clock. The ribbon cutting is set for 4:30. They have requested Administrator Leonard and myself to be at the ribbon cutting at 4:30 on the 5th. So that is the budget date.
I'm glad they coordinated that way.
So
Let me ask you this, are people adverse to an evening meeting? Are you adverse to a meeting that begins at 6? Would that work?
I think that'll work. I think they've got it scheduled from 3 till 5 or 5:30, something like that, with ribbon cutting at 4:30.
But you're not gonna be able to cut the ribbon and get out of there right away.
No, so it would have to be.
So it'd be 5:30 or 6. So are you okay? Anybody object to meeting on the 5th at 6? Does that work for you? I know it creates problems relative to staffing up front, but I think given where we are, we'll think that works.
That would work on my end. An evening meeting would be fine.
Same with me.
What about an earlier in the afternoon meeting? I'm just throwing it out as a possibility. Creates a little bit less challenges with security and that kind of thing. I don't know what everybody else is doing.
I would have a harder time getting there in the afternoon, earlier.
Yeah, I've got a 1:30 water utility commission, so I wouldn't, I couldn't do it earlier that day.
Timber in chat.
I just want to add that I will not be available in the evening on the 5th. So just want to put that out there as well.
Is there a time that you would be?
I would prefer more in the afternoon. That's just my thoughts because Tuesday the 5th, I would be I have some other commitments in the evening.
I think that's a critical meeting for us as a committee. Are we wedded to the 5th? Can we move to Lance, I'm looking at you, the 4th or the 6th?
The county board has, you have committee meetings, as I understand, on the,
6th is Public Safety and Health and Human Services.
right, public safety and health and human services on an extension on Thursday.
So
Yeah,
Thursday
that's
would
right.
be better, that gives us more time to get this thing prepared.
It's true.
I'm good with that. I mean.
What's that?
I'm fine with Thursday if you wanna, actually, that day works fine if you want, sometime in the middle of the afternoon, because you have extension at 4, so, I don't know.
And that's gonna be primarily the budget, so,
I'll make my budget presentation to you guys, you can ask questions, you're gonna have till the following week to actually take action on it anyway.
It's just to clarify, we're looking at for the Thursday, the 7th, around, are we thinking around like 3:30? Is that what we're thinking?
You have
Where you got-
extension, education, economic development in that in the courthouse assembly room at 4.
So it'd have to be like.
So it'd have to
1
be,
o'clock.
yeah,
We can't have
sometime,
it in another room or.
Yeah, or have it at 5.
Because I was gonna say that I do have, I'm on the panel for the new refugee group that's gonna be held virtually at 4. So I'm planning on being there as well, being there.
is that at 4 or at 6?
Oh, maybe it's at 6. I'm looking at the wrong schedule. Oh, it's 6. I'm sorry. If it is 6, I'll be available. Sorry about that.
I don't know if noon, do you want earlier or what? We're here to serve you.
This is
Right.
Craig. On the 7th, I have a meeting at 6:30.
I think you're gonna have to, afternoon, 1 o'clock.
Yep.
How would 1 o'clock work on the 7th? Jennifer, you're the one that's funding my social security, so how does that work for you?
It's difficult. And you said 1:30?
1 or 1:30, 1 o'clock.
All right. I'll make it work.
And we'll try to limit that to Lance?
Well, I'll be done by,
4.
for sure. I wouldn't expect to go longer than an hour and a half. Let's say an hour and a half. I'll talk for an hour and a half at the most. Christie will have it.
Well,
I'm writing that down.
I'm holding you to that.
You got 20 minutes.
That's the opening.
So clarification,
let's-
1 o'clock or 1:30?
1 o'clock. Gives us
1 o'clock work?
gives us
1
a
o'clock
little-
is fine.
Okay,
Good.
thank you.
Gives us a little more time, so that.
All right.
1 to 3.
One no later than 3. And we'll have a chance on the following, we're not taking any action. We'll have a chance the following Tuesday to get into that detailed discussion.
Contact clerk, county clerk, make that reservation.
Yep.
All right, so
I'll take it right
we're gonna
after
meet on the 7th. Do we make sure we get that into the calendar
Yep.
tomorrow?
I'll do it before I leave tonight.
But with Kim and.
Yep, I'll email her.
Okay, thank you.
But 1 o'clock on the 7th.
Correct.
Thank you.
Anything else? If not, a motion to adjourn is in order. Supervisor Leahy?
Second.
Second.
There was a hand that went up.
Like an auction rules.
And second by Gibbs. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, no? You handed.
You get to stay here if you say no.
We are adjourned.